I'm going to put a weaker transmission in my truck, and here's why that makes sense. Maybe. So this is the original transmission that came out of the truck. It's an M5 ODR2. It's a transmission made by Mazda and is meant to be in a truck. You can see how far forward the shifter is relative to this T5 here. And technically this transmission's rated at 330 foot-pounds of capacity, and this one is rated at, I think, 265 for 1989. But here's the thing. This one won't shift over 5,000 RPM. This one will shift pretty much wherever you tell it. And I built a motor for this truck a couple of years ago that I want to rev to about 7,000 RPM. And these transmissions have never let me do it. Next problem we're going to run into though, as I'm sure you can see the measuring tape there, I'm trying to figure out, see how much further forward that shifter is? That's going to be a problem inside the truck because this one, according to my measurements, is going to come out basically under the bench seat. Now there are a couple solutions for that. Potentially number one, and what they do in like old hot rods and stuff, is you build a plate that bolts onto here and make a linkage from the shifter to here and then have a shifter up here. But that's going to be really sloppy and take up a lot of space, and I'm probably going to have to cut up the floor of the truck to make it fit, and I really don't want to do that. The second option is you can buy a different tail housing assembly from, I can't remember the place, but that moves this shifter to here. But they're about $1,000, and I don't even have that in this whole transmission, so that's a little silly to me as well. The best solution that I've found, and it's going to be tricky and it's going to take forever to find the part, but if I can find a T5 out of a Chevy S10, those had the shifter a little further forward even, so it's about a 1/4 inch further forward than anything you can get with the Ford shifter pattern. And those will bolt right up to this and move it forward just far enough so you can see, even if it's here, it's going to be a couple inches further back. I think the actual number is going to be like 3, but that will just barely fit through the existing hole in the floor. So if anyone's got a T5 out of an S10 laying around, let me know, especially if you're in Southern Ontario. Let me know if you guys want to see more stuff like this. I'm trying out a few different things on this channel to see what people are interested in, but it's been fun so far. Man, I've been working on this thing so long, it never really occurred to me that it's turned into a build. It's just been my first truck, but I guess I'll give you guys a quick rundown on it to get you up to speed. So this is the majority of the modifications I did to it. I built this engine for it during COVID. This was kind of my COVID project. It had the 306 in it, and I switched it out to a 302. It's got ProComp 210 heads, Performer RPM intake, Ford F303 cam, and some headers that literally came off of a Derby truck, but worked pretty good. Flowmaster 40 for the exhaust, dumps out the side there. Now, as soon as I built the motor for it, I ended up with really bad wheel hop. So that's what the traction bars are for. It's also got the leaf springs all clamped together, and it does have competition engineering, not that you can quite see them, shocks in the back for the 50/50 drag shocks. Put drag radials on it. I don't know if those helped or hurt the situation with wheel hop, but then I found out something about drive shaft critical speed, broke the drive shaft. So now I've got this giant aluminum drive shaft in it that's indestructible. And that brings us to where we are now. So I broke this transmission at the end of last year. I broke the output shaft on it, put a new one in with carbon fiber line synchros. Didn't really help my shifting situation. So now we're gonna try the T5 with an S10 tail housing once I can find one. Public service announcement. Maybe don't cold start your side pipe truck next to a 55 Chevy with white walls, because you'll make a mess of it, and these white walls are a bitch to clean. All right, guys, we're back out here again today working on the truck, and I don't know if anybody's noticed, but it hasn't moved in any of the videos I've done so far, and this is why. See that half a bag of floor dry there? That's not good. So this thing has a hard time keeping belts together. I'm not sure. I think it's probably this really sketchy idler pulley I put together, because I just checked the alignment of the alternator. That's what I had thought it was before. This aftermarket bracket I figured was just pushed out a little bit too far, and that was causing the belts to shred. But I'm kind of thinking it's got to be this. Anyway, what happened was a piece of this belt, you can see it's gotten thin, got wedged between this pulley and the pump, and that's all my power steering fluid that's on the ground. So we got to figure out where that's coming from and how we're going to fix it. I don't know if you guys will be able to see this, but there's fluid coming from the bearing there, so that's got to be it. You can see kind of that bright stuff spinning around in between the pulley and the mount there. I think that's our problem. So we're gonna have to get a whole new pump. I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't helping our situation either. See how close the belt's getting to that bracket? It's pretty much touching it. And if you look, there's a little bit of kind of black goop and stuff there. I bet that's not helping the belt. So we'll get this pump off and replaced in, I'm probably not gonna do a video of actually replacing the pump. I'm not a mechanic, this isn't a how-to channel. I'm a hack at best, so you shouldn't get your advice from me. But if you really want to see this come apart, let me know, and I'll maybe put that together too. This is a really fair point, and if I was in the States, I'd probably consider it, but it's still kind of expensive to do it this way, and I'll explain here why. So I paid $750 Canadian for this thing, and I think I've got a whole S10 transmission to do the tail housing swaps lined up for about 500 bucks. TKO or TKX up here, you're looking at probably $4,000, and that you still won't be able to make work in my truck, specifically because of the shifter location like I've talked about before, because it's still going to shift way back here. So then you've got to buy another kit that's almost $1,000 for a mid shift on the TKO or TKX. So now I'm in at $6,000, whereas this one I'm going to be maybe $2,000, including a new clutch and all that fun stuff. I do really wish I could make it work with a TKO or a TKX, but it's just really not in the budget for this. I don't have $6,000 in the entire buildup of this so far, so putting that into just a transmission is a little bit much for me. Plus, I think this motor doesn't make the torque to need a TKO or TKX. I think the T5 will be fine, but if it's not, we'll figure out how to make it better and make it live anyway. I bought an even weaker transmission for my truck again, and here's why that makes sense too. Well, now I've got 3 transmissions on the floor, and you'll notice the one on the end there is a little bit different again. This is a T5 also, but it's out of a V6 S10 from I think late 80s to early 90s. I'm not using the whole transmission though, I'm just using the tail shaft housing. I'm gonna put that on this one, which is gonna move the shifter a lot closer to where it is on the stock transmission. Believe it or not, a Chevy transmission parts will actually just bolt right onto this Ford transmission because they're both made by Borg-Warner. The reason I'm doing this is for shifter location. The stock shifter was here. The Mustang transmission will work better for my application, but the shifter's way back here. The S10 transmission, or the tail housing, moves the shift point way back up here, which is almost in line with a little, I'll bend the bar straight over and up, and then that'll work perfect. I won't have to cut the floor in my truck. So stay tuned, there'll be more truck content soon. I just have to get this new intake manifold on the drag car for the last race that's on the 29th. After that, that's going in the shed, and I'm gonna be putting this new transmission in the truck. Like and follow for more. Have any of you guys ever had a drive shaft explode at 100 miles an hour? Because I have. Some of you may have noticed this absolutely giant 5-inch drive shaft in my truck and wondered why I had that. Long story short, this exploded on me when I was allegedly doing very high rates of speed, you know, on a closed road in Mexico and all that. Now, at first I was a little confused as to why that exploded, because I'd actually driven the truck faster than that before, so it should have happened earlier. The change was I had put 410 rear gears in the truck, and it had 308s in it previously, so that increased the drive shaft speed like 25%. Now, what I didn't know at the time, but do now, is there's something called drive shaft critical speed. That's basically the point at which the drive shaft reaches some weird harmonics and no longer can stay straight, so it flexes. Once it flexes, it goes out of balance and will rip itself in half, as you can see here. The scary part is once that happens, this drive shaft will drop down, dig into the ground, and actually lifts the back of the truck up into the air. Moral of the story, guys, if you're gonna hot rod your truck and put really steep rear gears in it, make sure you upgrade your drive shaft. Man, drag radials suck in the snow. I think we're gonna get back to working on this truck for a little bit. Everything I have to do with this is pretty serious stuff, and I just don't feel like it right now. So I pulled the truck out of the shed so that I could get these 2 transmissions out so that we can put that tail shaft on the T5 from the Mustang. It's supposed to be a fairly straightforward swap, but we're gonna find out here in a minute. Quickly for everyone who's new here, this is an M5OD R2. They're a truck transmission, they suck for high horsepower and fast shifting. So I'm gonna T5 swap this truck, but the Mustang shifter location's too far back, so we're gonna put this tail shaft from an S10 on it. Follow along, I'm gonna tear these two apart once they get warmed up. Hot rodding can be a real pain in the ass sometimes. Another problem we're gonna run into T5 swapping this truck is a T5 from factory is a cable type throwout, but this truck is set up for a hydraulic master cylinder. Companies make these really cool kits that bolt to the side of the transmission to pull this, but then we still need an aftermarket master cylinder. Willwood makes a million different ones though, so we'll probably find something that works. The bolt pattern on this one is about 3 1/4 spacing though, and everything they make's 2 1/2, I think, or 2 1/4. So we'll have to build an adapter plate or something like that. But that's a problem for when the transmission's actually in the truck. I'm gonna put nitrous on my truck for drivability reasons. Hear me out here. So as you can see, I've got an Edelbrock carb on my truck, and these are known for hot start issues, which basically is where the intake manifold heat soaks after you shut the engine off. The carburetor then gets hot enough that it boils all the fuel out of the bowls, and so it takes forever to restart them because you have to refill the bowls with fuel. Now the solution to this is normally a carb spacer, and I don't have any carb spacers laying around, and really, this is just a plastic carb spacer with some extra parts on it. And from constantly upgrading this drag car over the last 1.5 years, I have this whole box of parts that's just nitrous stuff. And I actually have 2 different kits to pick from. So why not? A 50 shot, or maybe 100, should wake it up pretty good. You're right, here's the slave cylinder right here. Problem is, this isn't going into an S10, it's going into an F-150. So this bell housing won't work, therefore neither will the slave cylinder. The only part of this transmission we're using is the tail housing, so from here back, because the Mustang transmission has better ratios and is a little bit stronger. We just need this to get the shifter in the right location for a truck. More progress on the T5 swap for the F-150. So if you missed the live I did today, we got both T5s apart so we can swap the tail housings. I do still have to get this top plate off. I believe I have to put the S10 top plate on as well, or at least this shaft has to go on. I do also have the truck in the garage. Normally in the winter, Jane will park in this bay and I'll work on stuff in this one, but she's on Christmas break right now because she's a teacher, so I'm stealing this one back because she's not going anywhere for a little bit. I did end up getting the top plate off. I'm not sure how all this witchcraft works in here. This is the S10, you can tell because it's got the shorter shaft. The Mustang one is a lot longer. I've got to figure out how this whole mechanism works because this one is all jumbled up. Now this probably just looks like a pile of old parts, but it's kind of a big deal. This is an S10 tail housing from a Chevy on a Ford T5. You can see how far forward it moves the shifter. And basically the whole idea is to move the shifter as far forward as possible, because by my measurements, without doing that, it'll come out about here in the truck, but now it's going to come out closer to here, and then with an offset, we'll be able to run a stock shifter location. Which is important to me because my family's had this truck since it was brand new, and I'm not cutting a hole in the floor just for a different transmission. More big progress on the T5 swap for the F-150. So I've got the tail housing on here. You can see the top plate, I figured it all out. Just mocked everything up with a few bolts just to make sure it shifted fine with the S10 top plate, and it seems to be working. I still have to get a short shifter for this. I really don't like how long truck shifters generally are, but it is already shorter than the M5OD shifter. So now we got to take all this back apart, silicone it up, and then we can start mocking it up in the truck. Why do I have an HEI distributor on a Ford? A few of you have asked what the deal is with this distributor setup, so let me show you. Basically what we have here is, I think it's actually Jegs branded, an HEI distributor for a small block Ford. They don't sell this one anymore, unfortunately, with the right gear for a roller cam from factory, so you have to buy the distributor gear separately for that. I ran just the factory module for a little while, but honestly, they're junk. And this coil is too. I'm gonna put an MSD one in shortly. The timing was locked out, but since I took this apart to show you guys, I just discovered these little wires are actually broken. So I only had vacuum advance, no mechanical. For whatever reason, this camshaft really prefers a lot of timing at idle. But you can see, no module. This was basically just here for the magnetic pickup and the coil. Inside the truck, I've got an MSD Digital 6 Plus, which lets me pull timing for maybe nitrous and have a two-step. These fuel pressure regulators look identical, but operate completely differently. So this is something I actually just learned recently. I thought you could use a regular 12806 Holley regulator to run in a bypass configuration, which is where instead of putting fuel in at the bottom and out either side, you put fuel in one of the sides, return it out the bottom, and then supply out of the other side. Which is how I have this one set up to step the stock EFI fuel pumps down to a carbureted fuel pressure. I was talking to somebody at Holley, and apparently that's completely the wrong way to do it. You need this one, which is 12803 BP. But the internal workings of these ones are completely different, so they'll supply smooth pressure. We'll listen to this one in a moment, but it basically pulses fuel pressure. It doesn't supply smooth pressure, which is unfortunate. And probably part of the reason this truck doesn't run as good as it should. Is the green truck down on compression? Let's find out. When I had it torn down to a short block, it looked fine, and so I just popped the heads on it and ran it. But I've had a sneaking suspicion for a while. There's a little bit of blow-by. I'm wondering if it's down on compression, so we're gonna do a compression test. I've never actually had a compression tool until basically today. And you're supposed to do this hot, but it's cold outside and I'm not putting the door up to get this up to temperature. Plus I've got the distributor torn apart and I just don't feel like it. So we're just gonna make the assumption that it's gonna be probably 20 or 30 PSI low from where it should be. So let's see what it pumps. So we're looking at, call it 120 PSI. According to a calculator I used on Wallace Racing, best case scenario with a perfect seal, we'd see 165. So given it's cold, I'm gonna call it good. Plus they're all showing the exact same pressure. Since I showed you guys the wrong way to lock out timing on an HEI distributor before, I should probably show you the right way too. It's honestly pretty simple. You basically put these little plates on instead of the flyweights and springs that are here so that you have no mechanical advance at all. I'm still running vacuum advance though, because for cruise and stuff, that's important. But this engine's got a big enough cam in it, it wants zero mechanical. Every engine is different though. This one wants no mechanical advance because it's only 9:1 compression. And then with the cam, it's like barely 8:1 dynamic compression, which means at low speeds, it's pretty inefficient and needs a bunch of timing to make up for the inefficiency. Plus this is stick shift, so there aren't really high load, super low RPM situations unless I put the engine there, which I don't. Today's the day, guys. The internet finally got to me. I bought a Holley for my truck. That Edelbrock's going in the trash. Probably not, but all these comments have got me thinking, and honestly, it's something I'd been debating doing from the start. Just when I started this project, I didn't have the money for a Holley. The Edelbrock was the cheapest 650 CFM carb on Summit's website, so that's what I went with. But I got this one. It's a remanufactured unit built locally for a reasonable amount of money, so I figured it's worth a shot. I'm really excited to see if this makes a big difference or not. Kind of thinking it probably won't be huge, but hopefully on the shifts it won't have that kind of Edelbrock bog where, you know, it's waiting for the air door to open up. Do need a couple of parts to finish the install, but we'll see that here shortly. What's the difference between an Edelbrock and a Holley? And which one should you run on your car or truck? The simplest way to put it is an Edelbrock will usually be close right out of the box, but almost impossible to get perfect. Whereas Holleys are a little bit fussier to get right, but you can get them absolutely perfect eventually. The biggest difference between them is how the power valve works and how the secondaries are controlled. In a double pumper Holley, everything is mechanically actuated. So the primaries and secondaries are 100% controlled by the throttle here, and secondary enrichment is done with an accelerator pump just like the primaries. An Edelbrock has a primary accelerator pump. However, the secondaries have a system called an air door that looks like another choke here. This is actually just a spring-loaded flap that basically restricts airflow through the secondaries until fueling starts to happen. So this just delays the secondaries opening, even though the throttle blades will open underneath. This will restrict airflow until fuel starts flowing. You guys really seem to like talking about carburetors. And a lot of you really hate these poor Edelbrocks. Now, I haven't had the greatest luck with this one, but on paper, these are actually a good carb for a street engine. You can make pretty aggressive cruise and wide open adjustments just by changing the needles that are under here, as well as when the, for lack of a better way to put it, power valve kicks in on these is adjustable just by these little springs, which I have, but never really needed to adjust. Compare that to a Holly, and the fuel bowl has to come off to change the jets, and I believe you even have to take the metering block off to change power valves. Which isn't really that big of a deal. You're gonna spill some fuel, but whatever, they make rags every day. And the Edelbrocks just don't have that same like snap that the Hollies do when you hit the throttle. Or at least I haven't found they do anyway. You guys really seem to like talking about carburetors. And a lot of you really hate these poor Edelbrocks. Now, I haven't had the greatest luck with this one, but on paper, these are actually a good carb for a street engine. You can make pretty aggressive cruise and wide open adjustments just by changing the needles that are under here, as well as when the, for lack of a better way to put it, power valve kicks in on these is adjustable just by these little springs, which I have, but never really needed to adjust. Compare that to a Holly, and the fuel bowl has to come off to change the jets, and I believe you even have to take the metering block off to change power valves. Which isn't really that big of a deal. You're gonna spill some fuel, but whatever, they make rags every day. And the Edelbrocks just don't have that same like snap that the Hollies do when you hit the throttle. Or at least I haven't found they do anyway. I may have used too much silicone. All right, guys, in the last live I did, we did finish up this transmission, so it's reassembled. It really just needs the short shifter on it, and it's ready to go. Which means I really have to stop procrastinating, and I need to order all of the parts that I need to put this in my truck. I still need a shifter, flywheel, clutch, master cylinder, and slave cylinder. Not really looking forward to spending the money, but it's gonna be worth it in the end, I think. Because right now, I think my shift times on the M50D are over a second, and this should drop it down to a few tenths of a second. Don't mind this wrench. This is just me messing around to see when I move the shifter offset, whether it was gonna hit the case or not. I threw out the factory fuel injection on this truck just to put a carburetor on it. That might seem like a big step backwards, and in some ways it is, but I did it mostly for cost reasons. Tunable aftermarket fuel injection for one of these trucks was pretty expensive at the time that I did this. I really just didn't want to mess with a laptop. It was actually really easy to do though. Basically, you just take your stock fuel lines here, run them into a bypass regulator, and run that straight to the carburetor. You do have to play around in the fuse box a little bit to make the fuel pumps run full time. And then you've got to sort out your ignition. I initially ran the HEI because I could start it with one wire, so I just had the key turn the ignition on, obviously, and everything worked as normal. So this is still running with the stock EFI fuel pumps and lines, just with a carburetor on it, basically. Probably shouldn't do this, but I need to ask the internet for advice. My short shifter just shipped today for this, and that's got me thinking about what I need to do to convert this to hydraulic. The way this worked from factory is there was a cable that came in from here and pulled on this fork to disengage the clutch, but my truck is set up for hydraulic, and there's no good way to make the pedals work with a cable type. So this was plan A, but these are pull type, not push type, so that won't work because they're too long to go between the fork and the front of the bell housing. This is the right way to do it, but they're the most expensive and the hardest to adjust. These I just found, they seem like they'd work pretty well, and the cost is somewhere in between the other two. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. So how do you make your truck sound like this? Assuming you're starting with a 5-liter, you're gonna need a few things. For one, this engine's carburetor swapped, has aluminum heads, F-303 Ford racing cam, and long tube headers. And then the exhaust itself is 3-inch tubing into a single 3-inch Y, back to a Flowmaster 40 with dual 2¼ outlets dumped in front of the box. Set the idle at about 800 RPM and you're gonna get that beautiful chop. I paid more for this shifter than the entire transmission it's sitting on, and here's why that makes sense. So for those of you just joining, this is a Mustang T5 with an S10 tail housing to move the shifter forward to work in a truck, but the stock shifter is kind of garbage. So the stock shifter throw in this truck is about 8 inches, and the shifter is about 17 inches long. The S10 shifter is about 17 inches as well, and when I had it on here, it was about a 10-inch throw, so it would have been an even longer shifter than stock. And the new shifter goes from 14.25 to 21.25, so we're looking at a 7-inch throw. So overall, not a huge change in shifter throw, but this is so much tighter. The original shifter was really, really sloppy in the truck, and it was one of the main things I didn't like about it. Just listen to this. A dead blow? No, we're not that fancy here. What I have is this. No idea what the weight is, but it's a hand-me-down, or inherited from my grandpa, and it's really irresponsible. As you can see, it was a full-size sledgehammer at one point, but it broke, so we cut the rest off, and now it's for when you're really angry at something. But honestly, the floor in this truck's pretty thin, so I just used the ball peen on the round end because it makes the nicest dings in it so that you can move the most material quickest. Not good. I'm just working on getting the transmission out of this truck. This is a good time to show you guys just how giant the drive shaft I had made is. When I went to drain the transmission, this is how the plug looked. So I guess we were going to be changing this thing sooner or later anyway. It's just eating itself alive. Look at that glitter. You guys tell me all the time that the T5s aren't that great, but they have to be better than these junk M5ODs. No more junk Mazda transmissions in this truck. It's out on the floor. If you're ever taking one of these transmissions out of an OBS F-150, make sure you take the crossmember out because that saves a bunch of time. Time to start mocking up the T5 in the truck. This is pretty much the moment where we find out if this transmission is going to work or if I've just wasted a whole bunch of time and money on a T5. I've got the transmission on the right angle here. Just with the jack, and you can see it is just touching the floor of the truck, but we've got about 1/8 of an inch we can take off of the top of that shifter, and we can hit the floor really hard with a hammer a few times and it should clear. Time to take a grinder to a brand new short shifter. Man, I hate cutting up perfectly good parts, but whatever, now this should clear the floor in my truck. So now that the shifter clears the floor, we have to get it to where it'll come out the factory opening in the floor, which is about here. So we've got this piece on here, and just for fun, this is kind of sorta where the shifter's gonna end up, and you can see, works perfect. The important thing to watch here is that this piece here never goes above roughly parallel. The floor does slope up, but I wanted this to stay as close to flush as possible so that it never has a chance to actually hit the floor. So why am I building a long box truck when a short box is the more desirable configuration? The short answer is because it's what I have, but there's a bit of a story to that. So my parents bought this truck brand new when they got married. It was my dad's daily driver until they had my younger sister. I actually came home from the hospital in this truck the day I was born. You can see the picture here. And even when they couldn't use it every day anymore, they never got rid of it. My grandpa told them this was kind of like the last really old school truck, so they had to keep it. And so it mostly just sat around in storage. And then they gave it to me when I turned 16 so that I had something to drive to high school. I actually drove this truck stock other than I cut the exhaust off until about 2020 when I started the 5-liter swap. I've got the transmission back in the truck, just got to bolt the drive shaft up in the back here, but I feel like I'm missing something. Oh shit. I'm just messing with you guys. I'm still waiting on a flywheel. But I do have the crossmember modified so that the transmission is sitting on it solidly now. So I'm gonna weld little supports in, but this is basically all I had to do was bend that piece up a little bit, and I'll weld in some reinforcements, bolt that down, and the transmission is on the right angle even with it set up like this. The drive shaft does kind of appear to be maybe 1/2 inch too long, so I'm gonna have to take that to the shop to get it shortened, but otherwise I think we're in pretty good shape here. And with the transmission bolted in properly, this feels so nice to shift. This is the most solid shifting transmission this truck's ever had. So why did I take a 306, arguably one of the most reliable engines ever made, out of my truck to put a 5-liter in? Simple answer. Although the 300 straight 6 is super reliable and there are a couple of things you can do to make more power with them, I'd have spent twice as much money as I did on this entire engine to make less power than this made stock or very lightly modified. This thing's almost 400 horsepower, and I'd have struggled to make 250 with the 306. I do still have the original motor for this truck, just in case I come up with a project where I need something like that, but this is supposed to be kind of like a fun street strip kind of thing, so it needed a 5-liter. Should you run a 5-liter Coyote or a small block Ford? Now, I'm pretty sure what you were actually asking is what was in the truck. Small block Ford 5-liter. And I did that for one simple reason: cost. I've got probably 350, 380 horsepower out of this 5-liter, which is pretty close to what a Coyote 5-liter would make stock if you did swap one in. But when I put this motor together, I think it cost me about $2,000 all in. And 3 or 4 years ago, Coyotes were a lot more expensive than they are now. You couldn't buy one for like $5,000 or $6,000 at the time. Not to mention, at the time, I would have had to go to a different transmission, which I simply couldn't afford to do. So I used this one for as long as I could. We're gonna make this truck rev so much faster. At least I think we will. I can't actually find any data on this. Part of swapping from the M5OD to a T5, which is currently in the truck, is that we've got to go from a 164 tooth flywheel to a 157, which also goes from 11-inch clutch to a 10.5. As I'm sure you can guess with the scale here, we're gonna weigh the two and see how big the difference is. The 164 stuff weighs approximately 51.5 pounds, and the 157 stuff weighs 41.8. So that's 10 pounds this truck no longer has to accelerate when you crack the throttle. Not to mention the smaller diameter. We can get into polar moment of inertia in another video, but that makes it better as well. What does that translate to in real world performance? It's gonna make it a little bit snappier from what I've read, but honestly, as far as ET gains and stuff go at the track, who knows? I think I've got to cut up more brand new race car parts. So here's where we're at. This is the stock clutch master cylinder for my truck, and this is the one I'm gonna have to run for the T5 swap. The overall length isn't a big deal because I'm just gonna add a turnbuckle here with an extension, so that's no problem. But the bolt pattern here and here are a fair bit different. But they're not different by enough that I can build a plate that bolts to this with studs out to bolt to this. The holes overlap. Our options are, we mount the master cylinder on an angle like this, which I don't love, or we're gonna have to slot the holes and then slide it over and hope that's enough clamping force. What would you guys do?
What this truck will be doing the second it is finished.
I think I finally have a plan to adapt this master cylinder. So as you can see, the hole's actually not perfectly round to begin with. And if I grind just a little bit down here, this should go on the bottom stud with no issues, and the top will actually clear the top stud. So that really didn't take much, but now you can see we've got lots of space on the top stud to get a nut on there. We'll just build a plate to bolt this to, slide that over both studs, and we're in good shape. It's never a good thing when a transmission's out on the workbench, but today it's actually because we've made a bunch of progress on T5 swapping this truck. We have the throw-up bearing distance set with these shims here. I explained how to do that in my YouTube video. We got the adapter plate done for this Willwood master cylinder. We got the custom clutch linkage set up. Not to mention we got the flywheel, clutch, and bell housing installed. We did run into some problems though, so go check out my YouTube video for the full details. So how do you get 350 to 375 horsepower out of a truck 5-liter? Pretty simple. What we have going on here, we'll start top to bottom. So 650 CFM carburetor is about all you're gonna need. I did carb swap this truck, so it's got a return style regulator to get it down to the carbureted fuel pressure. I ran an HEI distributor. Hindsight being 2020, I would have stuck with Ford stuff, but it's what I've got. We have a Performer RPM intake underneath that, ProComp 210cc cylinder heads, long tube headers. I want to say they're 1 5/8, so that's about what you want. And we do have an F303 cam in this as well. So to carb swap an OBS F-150, you need one critical part. You need a return style regulator that can lower your EFI fuel pressure down to carbureted fuel pressure. What's nice about doing it that way rather than switching to a carbureted fuel pump is you don't have to drop both fuel tanks, as this one has 2. And you also don't have to run new fuel lines. These are the factory fuel lines, just with adapters to 3/8 pipe thread. And before anybody freaks out, this zip tie is temporary. I've got a bracket and it's gonna mount down here. This is the one you need to make it work properly, 12-803 BP. Although it looks identical to a regular Holley regulator, it is slightly different and will provide smooth pressure rather than fluctuating pressure. You shouldn't have cut that truck up, Sonny. You should have left it stock. You know what? You might be right. But here's the thing. When I made the decision to swap a 5-liter into this and take the 306 out, I wasn't making a ton of money. And I didn't really know how I was going to be able to make enough money to have more vehicles than this and one daily driver. So I more or less decided this one had to be able to do everything. It had to be this truck, like I was never going to sell it, but it also had to actually be fast enough to be fun and, you know, at least keep up with modern traffic. Now, since then, I've gotten into car sales and now I make enough money where I can have this and I can have another car if I wanted to, but I still don't think I would have driven it if I hadn't done this swap. It really wasn't that fun to drive. It was really just the nostalgia and the, sentimental value. But now it's a blast to drive and I look forward to every spring when I can start driving it again. Not to mention, this thing has almost 200,000 kilometers on it, so it's not like I'm destroying some kind of collector value. And collector value doesn't matter to me anyway with this truck because I'm gonna keep it forever. I'm gonna start this thing with open headers just for you. The truck's not quite done, guys, but it's close enough that I can start it and do some preliminary testing just in the garage, and it's good motivation and fun to do. It's been about 2 months since I've started it, so we'll see how that goes. You can see I've got the shifter in. Let's give her. I wish it would quit snowing. We're into March. This is enough. The truck is really close to being done, guys, but 2 things are really holding me back. 1, it keeps freaking snowing every time I have free time, so I end up just cleaning driveways all day. And 2, I'm sure some of you guys do the same thing. When you get close to being finished a project and don't really have any deadline, everything just keeps getting pushed off. But for real this time, I think it's gonna be done this weekend.
First time driving my T5 swapped F-150.
Truck's cold. Transmission seems to work though. And we have overdrive. At 85 kilometers an hour, we're turning a whole 1500 RPM. That's pretty sweet compared to what I'm used to this truck. I was turning almost double that last year. It's cruising along pretty good. It'll actually take the gear now, which is nice. They used to not want to use overdrive with this motor, but that's because I had 308s in it at one point, and I didn't have the timing locked out, so it was trying to cruise at like 15 degrees of timing and it just didn't make any power. But wow, this is perfect. It's 1800 RPM at 95 kilometers an hour, which is exactly right with this motor. Seems very happy. It's a lot quieter in the cabin than it used to be. Everything seems to be working as planned. I hear a bit of an exhaust leak that we'll fix, but yeah, quite happy. Hopefully we have enough fuel to get turned around and get back. As it runs out of fuel. Oh no, it was just fuel starving on decel, that's fine. Oh, it's running out of fuel. We'll see if we can get home. Back in the garage and see if everything's still attached. T5 swap's finally done. I've got a full video on the other platform for how I've got the T5 done. I even did a little bit of driving in that video to see how it shifted. But I'm actually really happy with how this swap turned out. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you would never know I put a T5 in this truck. And it is gonna cruise good. I can do 95 kilometers an hour at about 1800 RPM. So it's a bunch quieter in the cab than it used to be, but it still pulls the gear pretty well and it'll cruise along like that pretty happily. Next up for this truck, once the weather gets warmer, we're gonna do an Edelbrock versus Holley competition on it. Not to mention, I'm finally gonna do the front brakes, get the parking brake working, and I don't know if you can see it there, but it needs an alignment pretty bad because we've taken so much weight off of the front of the truck. So you want your truck to run like this one? Here's what you're gonna need. And I will have an almost complete parts list at the end of this video. So starting off, this truck is carb swapped. If you go into some of my other videos, you see how I did that. We've got a Performer RPM intake under that, ProComp 210cc heads, HEI distributor. I'd stick with the Ford one if I was doing this again. It's got a Ford Performance F303 cam, long tube headers, and this is on a stock 5-liter truck short block. If I was doing it again though, and especially if you're looking for a mild build, I'd stick with like ported stock heads or GT40s or a more mild head than these ones. These are way too big for a mild build. Not to mention it makes peak power way too high now, so the stock transmission didn't work anymore. It wouldn't shift at the higher RPM, so I had to switch to a T5 from a Mustang, which if you watch some of my other videos and on YouTube, it's a whole process. So as promised, here is the most complete list I have of the parts I used to do this swap. I wish I had kept track of part numbers, but this is as good as it gets. This pricing is also probably a little bit optimistic for 2023. This was done in like 2019 or 2020. I should add nitrous to my truck? You must be new here. Of course we're gonna add nitrous to my truck. And with everything going on TikTok right now, keep in mind guys, I have the same username everywhere, so go check me out there too. The only reason we haven't put a nitrous kit on this truck yet is because before we add nitrous, I'm gonna compare an Edelbrock carb to a Holley. Not to mention, we had to make sure that the T5 swap was actually gonna work. But don't worry, it's gonna get a little shot of nitrous from this plate here, once spring rolls around and we get those other two things finished up.
Bug spray.
There's no way this works. There is no way this works. There is no way this works. There's no way. This can't work. This can't work. There's no way. Let's see if it worked. It might have worked. Actually, it definitely worked. Before, after.